A new G2 is born. America and China are cutting deals. The Indo-Pacific Strategy, India's grand bet, is in tatters. Punished with 50% tariffs by its partner, while appeasing them by cutting off its friends, has India just made its greatest foreign policy miscalculation in a generation? And in a world of giants, where does India go from here? Hi, and welcome back to the Tryst. I am Chirag Sharma, and today we are privileged to be joined by our guest, Mr. Shyam Saran. Mr. Saran is not just a former Foreign Secretary of the Government of India, but he has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Climate Change and Nuclear Affairs, and he has also represented India in a multitude of countries abroad. In our show today, we are going to be moving beyond the headlines and dissecting global disruptions being unleashed, all uniquely from an Indian perspective. Mr. Saran's recent columns and his essay in the book India's Tryst with the World has been rather prescient and prophetic about the crises we face today. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I'd like to start with a rather sobering recent development, which is President Trump's meeting with President Xi Jinping, which I'm sure has spurred a lot of activity in the Indian foreign policy apparatus. So the official White House account tweeted about the concept of a new G2 to solve all of the world's problems. The reason I called your essay in the book very prophetic is that you warned of this exact scenario. You warned of a grand bargain where the US might essentially concede hegemony over Asia to China within what you called implicit spheres of influence. In which case, sir, one would assume that Asia obviously falls under the Chinese sphere of influence. Now that this has actually been verbalized by the American leadership, how do you exactly see this playing out?
Thank you. So let me perhaps just nuance that argument a bit. I think it is still premature to say that the United States of America has fully conceded Asia to Chinese domination. I don't think we have reached that point as well. The reason why I say that is that in advance of his meeting with President Xi Jinping, you saw how Trump went to Kuala Lumpur. He did a deal with Malaysia there. He had a good meeting with some of the ASEAN countries. He claimed that he had played an important role in settling the conflict between Cambodia and Thailand. Thereafter, he paid a visit to Japan. And in Japan also the draft agreement on trade, which had been already finalized earlier, that was now signed and concluded. In South Korea, he had a meeting with the South Korean president, who's a new incumbent to the post. And in all these capitals, Asian capitals, he in a sense reaffirmed that US was, fully committed to its allies in the region. Previous to that, there was a very good meeting with the Australian Prime Minister, where they reached agreement on strategic minerals, on rare metals, which will of course take time to be implemented, but it's an important agreement in light of the fact that China has been using the export of rare metals or strategic minerals as a kind of a geopolitical leverage. So it has a certain significance in that. So I would say that what Trump has been trying to do is to see that how he can shore up his position with the Asian countries in order to set the stage for the deal that he wants to do with China. What is the difference here? The difference here is that if what he has been doing in Asia is basically like a tactical move, that it is not that he is fully committed to Asia, but he is doing this in order to signal to the Chinese that, look, we are still a very major power here. There is therefore a certain difference, because a strategic alliance is strategic. It is not that you use it as leverage for getting something from a bigger power. Here, I think while the US alliances remain, generally speaking, intact, but my sense was that he was using these alliances and the relations with the Asian countries as a kind of a leverage with China.
Get a better.
So that changes the thing. It is not that he's not telling the Chinese, look, don't be under any illusion that we are fully, committed to be an Asian power ourselves. So I think there is, to my mind, there is a certain shift which has taken place in the US commitment to what was the Indo-Pacific strategy. By the way, he himself had announced that strategy during his first term. But I think my own sense is, and it has been to some extent confirmed by the recent events in Asia and the meeting with Xi Jinping, that there is a certain kind of a downgrading of this Indo-Pacific strategy.
Right. So that's a rather encouraging sign to at least tell us that it's not a complete sacrifice of Asia on part
No,
of the Americans.
mostly that doesn't happen. I mean, changes take place, but there is a certain time frame within which things take place. It is still a fluid situation. It is not a settled situation. So we should not maybe jump to conclusions. But the trend line to me seems to be fairly clear.
Right. So that actually very well leads me to the second part of what I wanted to discuss with you today, and that's in relation to specifically India. So given that our grand strategy for years has been built around the framing of a US-led Indo-Pacific. You called it in your book a countervailing strategy to contain China. Given that there is some form of shift, in your own words, towards some form of retreat by the Americans in order to either gain a tactical advantage in negotiations with the Americans or maybe a longer term strategic goal. In that case, sir, do you think that the Indian foreign policy framework that has been built around the idea of an Indo-Pacific, which has America as a major actor, do you think that then is found to be flawed in some sense, or do you think it is essentially rendered obsolete if we go to the maximalist argument?
See, I think it is very important that in the analyses that we do, we don't fall prey to wisdom by hindsight. That because something is happening today, everything that happened before was therefore negated. It doesn't happen that way. So we should put Indo-American relations in a proper context. And the context was that, for example, when I was foreign secretary and we were negotiating, for example, the nuclear deal, there was a different kind of a perception on the part of the US, but also a different perception on the part of India. So what was the US perception? The US perception was not that they were necessarily trying to contain China, but they certainly felt that the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, or what at that time was known as the Asia-Pacific, the balance of power was shifting because of the emergence of China as a very substantial economic and military power. So that was the perception that, look, our position in Asia-Pacific is in a sense being pressured by this new development which is taking place. Secondly, US being very conscious of the fact that the center of gravity of the global economy had moved from the transatlantic, it had moved to the trans-Pacific. Precisely because of the emergence of not only China, but the emergence of a country like India, the emergence of Southeast Asian countries. So here was a region which was much more dynamic, and where in terms of military power, in terms of economic power, there was a shift taking place to this region. In order to make certain that the US retains its dominant position globally, it had to be dominant here. That was very important. Not very important now that it should be dominant only in Europe. It has to be dominant in the region, which is becoming the central node of the entire international order. So that was the American perception. In that perception, they looked upon India as a country which, for its own reasons, not because it was allied with the US, but for its own reasons, would be pursuing policies which would be also supportive of what the US was. So there was a strategic convergence between India and the US that both countries were facing a new challenge in a rapidly rising China. And therefore, even if they are not allies, a certain degree of coordination between them would be a good thing, you know. And US recognizing that even though there was a gap between India and China, India was also a rising power. India also had the potential to emerge as a very major power in the future. So that is the underlying basis of the relationship. Now, it is wrong to say that all India's foreign policy was just based on this. Yes, this was important, but there are many other elements of the Indian policy. For example, governments have followed over a period of time what we call strategic autonomy. That is, you must not fall into a position where you become a subordinate ally of a major power. You should have your own room for maneuver. The importance attached to your neighborhood. We say neighborhood first policy, that also is not entirely related to this. Or the kind of, participation that we have pursued, say, in other regional organizations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS, for example, or now the BRICS Plus, or our interest in, say, BIMSTEC. So there are a number of these regional organizations where also we have been very active, because we feel that the more engaged we are with a multiple number of countries and powers, the greater room for maneuver that we have. So, yes, this particular assumption that it is likely that the US Indo-Pacific strategy will not undergo a major change, because the US itself has identified the Indo-Pacific as the central point of its global strategy. Today, it seems it may not necessarily be the central point. He is talking about hemispheric, engagement. That the priority should be given not to other regions of the world. The priority should be given to the Americas. That is why he is talking about Canada becoming the 51st state, or saying that Greenland should be, sold to the United States of America, or he is sending his navy to the Caribbean, to off the coast of Venezuela. So what he is trying to project is, this is what is the most important to the United States. Maybe Indo-Pacific is not as important as this. Now, as I said, we should be careful. We should see how this plays itself out. These are trends at the moment. They have not settled into a new kind of geography of world politics.
Right. So that was indeed a very detailed and insightful answer. Just as a thread of that, since you specifically mentioned that even there are chances that, and it's more likely that there isn't a major change in American Indo-Pacific strategy because of the Asia pivot that you rightfully mentioned, that America now believes that it needs to maintain a dominant power if it wants to be the global hegemon in Asia and in Indo-Pacific. In that context, sir, the primary tool of sort of strategic engagement for America over the past, let's say, decade has been the Quad. Now, sir, there already have rhetoric is very high between the Indian government and the American government. There is a Quad summit coming up. Where do you see the Quad standing as an organization currently on the basis of the very trends that you just described?
So, the Quad is only one link in that larger Indo-Pacific strategy of the US. Because, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, the US has very strong alliances with some of the countries in the region. Japan, for example, is one. Korea, ROK is the other. It has very strong military links with, say, Singapore. It also maintains a fair amount of military capabilities even in countries like, say, Thailand. Okay. So and Australia, you know, the AUKUS, for example, the Australia, US, UK nuclear submarine alliance is a very important part of that. So we should not look at Quad as the only element there. There are other elements of which Quad is a part. Quad is a little different from the others because we are not an ally of the United States. So if you look at the Quad, the other partners are allies, but India is not. But still, because India is not, it has a different status. It has a different importance. So what we are seeing today is that this policy of ensuring that the alliance with Japan and the ROK remain intact. Not only that, how can we persuade ROK and Japan to work closely together because there has been some tensions between them. Biden did a great deal to try and make this into a truly trilateral alliance, not only just bilateral alliances between the US and Japan and US and ROK. The other aspect is the restoration of the alliance with the Philippines, also very important. Or what the United States has been doing with regard to, say, countries like Indonesia, trying to, improve relations with Indonesia. So if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy, there are different links in that, of which Quad is one. What we are seeing today is that that kind of commitment to these different links, that seems to be rather shaky. Okay. So AUKUS, he has reaffirmed that AUKUS, he will continue with it. We don't know because it's a 30-year, 40-year, program. What will happen in the meantime? We don't know. Many Australians are skeptical that this will actually be taken forward. The with regard to, say, Japan or Korea, the constant complaint is that you should be spending more. You should not be relying on the United States of America. There is also with respect to Taiwan, we see a certain kind of a change taking place because while Biden was very open saying if there is an invasion of Taiwan, US will intervene. He's not saying that. And when he's asked a question about Taiwan, he says, I don't want to talk about it. And in Taiwan itself, there is a fear that the kind of commitment that they had depended upon of US support, maybe that's not quite there. Will Taiwan become like a pawn in the negotiations between China and the US? So there are all these kind of changes taking place, and in that context, while we were very gratified that immediately after the inauguration of the new president, the first meeting which was held was of the Quad, of the foreign ministers. And it seemed at that time that the Quad was one stable element, even if things are changing around us. Today, we cannot say that because while there was supposed to be a Quad summit in India where Trump would have come sometime in autumn. Now we are almost at the end of the year. We don't hear anything from the US. We don't even hear anything from the Indian side. Is the Quad summit on or is it not on? And I think the general opinion is that probably it will not happen. So there is obviously the kind of importance that was attached to the Quad by the United States of America. That does not seem to be the case anymore. For example, when the Australian Prime Minister was visiting the White House, when they talked about reaffirmation of the AUKUS, there was not a word about the Quad. So, if it was something that Quad, as members of the Quad, the US and Australia will still attach importance to, surely there could have been some reference, even an oral reference, but there was none. So, all these are indications that probably the Quad summit is not going to take place, which means that the kind of importance which was attached to it by India as part of its own Indo-Pacific strategy, that perhaps needs reassessment.
Uh, Thank you so much, sir. Again, very insightful. And this idea of a recalibration, this is quite fascinating given the fact that in your essay in the book also, you specifically lay out three pillars where Indian foreign policy should be focused or geared towards in order to hedge our bets and also provide a greater platform to India to sort of spring off. The first of these platforms is the European pillar, so to say. And it's a very fascinating concept that you talk about of the demise of the West. And then you specifically say that in relation to this demise of the West, that a strong and relatively independent Europe, which is sort of unshackled from complete dominance on America or complete reliance on America, could be a pillar of the multipolar order. And India, as a proponent of that multipolar order, should therefore seek a much closer partnership with Europe. Do you, in your opinion, sir, believe that there is enough Indian diplomatic energy and capital being spent on ensuring that the Indo-European partnership goes to a level which allows us to then move towards a multipolar world order, or even in terms of being a great partner to Europe? We've always heard talks about how Europe and China are very close in terms of economic linkages, in terms of all kinds of linkages. And India, this idea of China plus one, is India on the path of realizing that goal? Are we putting up enough diplomatic capital towards that?
So my sense is that the long-awaited India-EU free trade agreement is finally close to being concluded, and the reason why there is greater hope is precisely because of the geopolitical context. The US has the European Union has been very badly shaken by the kind of attitude which Trump has displayed towards Europe. In fact, the German Chancellor, the new German Chancellor, Merz, in fact, openly said that today the United States is the key adversary of Europe.
Yeah.
So, if the relationship between Europe and the US has become adversarial, our own relations are not going so well either. It stands to reason that India and the EU should see a certain common interest in coming closer together. And that is precisely as an IR expert would expect. That is precisely what is taking place. You saw this very unusual spectacle, which has never happened with any other country, of all the 27 EU commissioners coming on a visit to India. So I think they were also trying to demonstrate that they have a great interest in forging much closer relationship with India. I think you would have seen the news that for the next Republic Day, the EU leadership is being invited as chief guest. So that also is a kind of a symbolic way of saying, yes, we also attach a lot of importance to our relationship with you. So I do see the India-EU partnership in fact becoming much stronger as we go forward, because there are strategic reasons why the two sides should come together. And don't forget, there is a certain kind of a similarity between Europe and India. Both are multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual. They are plural democracies. So is India. I mean, India is one country, Europe is not yet one country, but there is a certain commonality between the two sides. So in a sense, Europe should have a stake in India's success as a plural democracy and vice versa. And this could become a stabilizing factor in what is a very, very rapidly changing kind of international environment.
Perfect, perfect. Also, something that is encouraging to look at in terms of a watcher of Indian foreign policy. The second pillar, sir, there were three pillars I talked about earlier. The second pillar is perhaps even more fascinating in terms of what you describe as a middle powers coalition. So it is not hidden from anybody that India is generally looked at as a leader of the global south and has been since the inception of India as an independent country. There's a lot of diplomatic capital being put towards that in terms of the non-aligned movement, India's role in a lot of global south movements. But sir, in relation to that, you say that a middle pass coalition, which I am calling the coalition of the willing, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and India obviously to lead that or play a leading role, uh, that could act as a group that resists these implicit spheres of influence that we talked about earlier. Uh, Again, a similar question to the first one. Do you think that there is enough effort on part of India and also on part of these powers to play a stabilizing role as you envision an India-EU partnership, for example, to play? And do you think that the government is putting enough diplomatic capital towards that, or are we still sort of, confused with regards to whether we want to expend our diplomatic capital towards great power politics in terms of our major partners, or do we want to build relationships with partners who would help us build a multipolar order, which we want at the end of the day?
So, two things. One is that the first pillar and this other pillar that you're talking about are not mutually exclusive. That is, it is not that you have to stop engaging with the superpowers, of the major powers, if you want to build up your relationship with the other middle powers, as we are talking about. We don't see necessarily a contradiction between the two. Okay. The idea is that at a time when we are not able to, with our own capabilities, military capabilities, economic capabilities, really have some kind of a equal status with the superpowers, whether you like it or not, you have to try and make up for that somewhat lesser capability by banding together with the others and banding together with countries who share your same dilemma. They also want that they should not have to become subordinate to the major countries. Therefore, they see a certain common interest. They may not have other common interests, but here certainly broad common interests they see. Now, we should not over interpret that, because each of these countries has interests within its own region. I mean, Brazil naturally would be looking at how it can build up a dominating position in Latin America, or South Africa as a leading, African country, or you see in the Middle East or the Gulf region. Obviously, Saudi Arabia considers itself to be the key power. So does Iran, and that is why there is a certain competitiveness there. What happens in Southeast Asia? Indonesia is emerging as a very substantial power. So these are countries which are also raising their profile in their own regions and are displaying more agency than they had been able to do before. So there is a change. Multipolarity is not something that you can pursue. Multipolarity is a state of being, in a sense. You are either there is a multipolar situation or there is not a multipolar. It is not that India wants to create a multipolar world. India cannot by itself create a multipolar world. We may prefer there to be a multipolar world, but to think that India has to work in order to bring about a multipolar world, that's not quite a realistic proposition. So what you have to try and do is, where do we see our strategic interests in terms of giving us more space at a time when that space is sought to be shrunk. And this is where I think the fact that despite the Trump's fuming against the BRICS, for example, or the SCO, India has maintained its linkages with these organizations. After all, the Prime Minister going to Tianjin for the SCO summit, not only that, but the kind of visuals which came out, of that certainly seem to indicate that no, India sees its interests better served by having these kind of broader engagement with other major powers.
Perfect, sir. Which brings me to the third pillar, and that is obviously much closer to home. Uh, so you critically pointed out the need for greater regional economic integration, including with Pakistan. Now, obviously, this was written before Operation Sindoor and Pahalgam. So maybe it needs to be looked at with a different lens. I'd like for you to enlighten us on that. However, the idea of regional economic integration is quite appealing, given that it has the keys to maybe a more prosperous and a more peaceful periphery for India. That then, coupled with your advice that India should look to join the RCEP as a means of increasing economic prowess.
And CPTPP.
Yeah, the Comprehensive Pacific Partnership.
Progressive, yeah.
In regards to both of those, and given that regional economic integration is an idea that has been floated around for quite some time, but not really taken to fruition yet, do you see that gaining more steam in the years to come? And what level of impact do you think it could have on transforming India's own periphery?
Yeah. So I think the first circle is of South Asia itself, what we call the Indian subcontinent. And then we come to the larger Asian space. So what I have been arguing is that unless you get your periphery right, that is the subcontinent right, playing a larger regional role in Asia or a larger global role will be suboptimal. Not that you can't play that role, but you'll always be drawn back to the subcontinent because there is a crisis happening in Nepal, or there is a change of government in Bangladesh, or something happens in Sri Lanka. Always you are drawn back. So any ambition that we have of being able to play a larger Asian role or a larger global role must be premised on pursuing a successful policy with regard to the subcontinent itself. What does it mean? It means that unless you can create this as a space of prosperity, as a space of political stability, you will have a problem in terms of your foreign policy. So, priority has to be given to your neighborhood. There are no two ways about it. We say neighborhood first, but we don't translate it into actual action on the ground. That is the problem. There is an asymmetry between what we are saying and what we are actually doing. So you have to pay much more attention to your relationship with each of your neighbors, and not only bilateral relations with each of your neighbors, but the regional dimension should not be forgotten. The regional dimension is very important. And here what I have argued is that India has actually an asset in its own size. It is the most powerful country economically, militarily, compared to all your subcontinental neighbors. Okay. So, even if, for example, you open out your market to everything that your neighbors can sell to you, it will still be a small fraction of your total market. You, in turn, can become an engine of growth for the rest of the region because you are so large. If you put your weight behind it, it can have a major impact on development within these smaller countries around you. So why not leverage that? You are the most important transit country for all your neighbors. They share borders with you, but they don't share borders with each other. You can become, instead of this being a negative leverage over your neighbors, why can't you make it into a positive leverage, where you become the partner of choice when it comes to transit? And yes, we have problems with Pakistan at the moment with Operation Sindoor, but I remain convinced that any kind of a regional policy of seeking stability, of seeking integration, doing without Pakistan is not a good option.
Right. Thank you for that, sir. That brings us to our last theme. And I'm glad we brought up the neighborhood because this is about the elephant in the room. It's regarding China. So we are now consistently seeing reports of a repairing China-India bilateral. High-level border talks. There are strategic talks with the Indian NSA and the Chinese NSA. You have a resumption of flights. There are loosening economic restrictions in some sectors. And even though this seems to be a tactical pivot by the Indian government in response to America's tactical pivot, and also in response to maybe American pressure on a lot of fronts. But there is definitely a concerted attempt to repair the bilateral. My concern, sir, and I'm sure a lot of people also reflect this concern, is the fact that because this negotiation with India and China is now happening at a time where repairing relations with China has become a necessity but not necessarily a choice. Uh, and I personally believe that because when you have pressure on all sides, like you correctly said, you need to have a stable periphery. So, given that it has now become a necessity, do you believe that India is negotiating from a position of weakness, or has there been enough groundwork laid for the past 5 years for this to happen at a time and place of India's choosing, so to say?
So, bilateral relations are they're bilateral.
Yeah.
So, there are two playing the game. So, we should not look at it as only what is India's game. India's game is also influenced by what is China's game, and whether there are still areas where you can actually play the game together, and which are the areas where you can't play the game together. So I would not look at this through that kind of a frame. Are we negotiating from a position of strength or position of weakness? That's not the issue here. The issue is, have we got to a point where, because of what is happening geopolitically, because of certain convergent interests that there are between India and China, which may not have been, say, 2 years ago after Galwan, uh, is there a change taking place? I perceive a change taking place. China is also anxious because of the great unpredictability and confusion there is around the world. Chinese want stability. They are not happy when things are, constantly in flux. So they are also looking for some stability in the system. At this point of time, they say, hey, when so many changes are taking place around, even in some of the settled democracies, there is internal political turmoil, which are two very large emerging countries enjoying a degree of political stability. Only India and China. So their argument to us is, look, when there is this kind of a flux taking place, which might affect us adversely, not because you are acting against us or we are acting against you, but because of what is happening around us. Does it not make sense for us as two major zones of stability to actually work together, so that we become kind of a stable anchor in this changing environment? So, when you said, oh, we are doing this under pressure from what is happening with the US, but the fact is that the first resumption of summit level meeting took place before Trump came to power. So the Kazan, meeting that took place, that was the first meeting after the Galwan crisis. So one cannot say that, India has been reacting to US pressures, and that is why the Tianjin meeting took place. No, Tianjin meeting actually worked on the kind of consensus that was already built up uh, by the time of Kazan. That is, we both have an interest in having a stable border. We should try and see whether we can work for peace and tranquility. We are not all quite there because the troops are still confronting each other. So I cannot say that the situation has been normalized. It has not been, but it has been partially normalized, and it is creating the opening for perhaps further political steps to be taken. It is true that in Tianjin there were some visible sort of uh, photo opportunities which showed that India was reconnecting with China, reconnecting with Russia. That's fine. But if you look at the readout of the Xi Jinping Prime Minister Modi's meeting, you can see in some subtle way that the differences continue. So I have pointed out, for example, that Xi Jinping has talked about multipolarity, right? We have said a multipolar world order depends upon having a multipolar Asian order, which is a very clear indication that we don't agree that we have to defer to a Chinese dominated Asia. So there are fundamental issues of that kind. But I think, given the kind of geopolitical situation that has emerged, there is a certain common interest on both sides that we should try and normalize our relations, reconnect with each other, begin again to cooperate on those areas where we have convergent interests. After all, that was the case for 40 years before Galwan happened.
Right. Perfectly, that brings me to my last question, sir. And you very rightly pointed out that there still exist fundamental differences in the China-India bilateral, with India obviously not ready to accept a subordinate role in Asia. In regards to that, sir, it has been long speculated and seen that Chinese strategic thought uh, sometimes looks at India as a junior partner in a Chinese dominated Asia. Given that that is the long term Chinese goal, do you think a repaired India China bilateral is sustainable over the long term? Or do you think, given that there is a flux in the international system right now, this is a temporary sort of measure or a truce, let's say, for the medium term in order to stabilize the situation and gain whatever we can from this specific bilateral?
So, one is that, it's not an either or situation. So, there will be areas where obviously there will be a kind of a, clash of interests, but there may also be areas where it is our common interest to work together. So there is a certain balance between the two aspects, which is what, as I'm trying to explain to you, which is what was happening before the current crisis. Now, what will be the future? Very difficult to say, because in very fundamental way it is related to, one, your own capabilities, economic capabilities, military capabilities, now technological capabilities going ahead. You have a major power gap with China at the moment. That power gap has actually been expanding. Now, if we are talking about whether we can avoid a China dominated Asia, is not just a matter of choice, but it is a matter of whether or not you are ready to get your act together and really work on building up your capacities. Good news is that it is not beyond our capacity to do that. We have shown in the past also that we can, move ahead with a high rate of growth, reduce the gap between India and China, but that is where choice comes. Not the choice in terms of, whether we bow down to China or don't bow down to China. Our ability not to bow down to China is dependent on what I do here.
Yeah.
If you get your, as I said, if you get your act together, then your foreign policy has greater space to operate on. But if you don't get your act together here and the gap keeps on increasing, no matter how good your foreign policy is, no matter how accomplished your diplomats are, that reality will always, come to the surface.
Come to the
Yeah.
surface. Right. Thank you so much, sir. With
My
that,
pleasure.
we do come to an end. But just before we leave, I'd like to ask you about 2 or 3 major ideas that you would like for Indian foreign policy and the foreign policy apparatus as a whole to focus on going forward, to both exploit these disruptions to India's benefit and in order to also, like you said, get our act together at home.
Yeah. So I mean, you have already mentioned the 3 pillars that are. So I don't really have much to add to that, because that is, in a sense, these are self-evident what you need to be doing. But eventually, I think foreign policy is also about how relevant is your foreign policy to what you have as a vision for India. Okay. So foreign policy must be relevant to the economic transformation of India. So you have to see economic transformation is what is the key pursuit that we must be engaged in for the next several years. How do I fashion a foreign policy that serves that end? Who are our likely partners in this? So we talked about, for example, the European Union. Why did we think of the US as such a big partner? Because the US was the #1 technology partner. It was a country which could help us in building up our defense capabilities. So in terms of how we look at partners is determined by who can help me in terms of that economic transformation. So this is something which has to be kept in mind, that foreign policy cannot be divorced from what your vision for the country is. So rather than talk about this or that, specific action that is to be taken, I would say, how do we reorient our thinking using this as the guiding star, and then determine how do we build up partnerships, who are likely to be partners, who are likely to hold us. That is really the issue. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
For me, at least, this was a very good distillation of what is a very complex web of geopolitics that is unfolding in front of our eyes right now. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners have also enjoyed this conversation.
I hope that this is something that we will enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for hosting us. Thank you.
Okay.
We hope you liked this insightful and fascinating discussion with our guest, Mr. Shyam Saran. If you'd like to watch more of our content and you like our work, please consider becoming a member and subscribing to our channel, The Tryst, as it encourages us and gives us hope of a better India. And if you'd like to read more about Indian foreign policy and the disruptions being unleashed, please consider buying a copy of India's Tryst with the World, out in stores now.